Welcome, everyone. We are live from DGB Group. This is our webinar, Carbon Units for Beginners. I'm Pedro Zemar and your host. And this with me today is Vink Schrawink, our Environmental Solutions Manager at DGB Group. How are you doing today, Vinke? Or should I say tonight for you?
Yeah, it's tonight already, 6. No, I'm doing very well, thank you. How about you?
I'm doing great. I'm very happy to be here. Well, it's an absolute privilege to have you here today, and I'm very much looking forward for the conversation that we're going to have later. But before we start, I just want to give a couple messages to the audience. This is being transmitted live, so if you have any questions, we do have a chat box here that you can type in your questions. I can already see that we already have some people asking questions. That's great. So if the question is related to the topic that we're talking about at the moment, I'm going to ask them directly to Vinke. If not, we're going to wait until the end, but we will try and get over all of your questions. Other than that, if you have any technical issues, please also let us know on the chat. We'll be more than happy to help you out to get you ready to learn everything that you need to know about carbon units, which is the topic we're gonna talk about today. I'm very excited to learn about this, Vinke, because I'm gonna be honest with you. I think that I don't know nearly as much as you do. So I'm very excited to see what you have to share with us today.
Yes.
Okay, so let's start with the very beginning. What is a carbon unit?
Yeah, well, that's indeed the very, very beginning. So a carbon unit represents 1 ton of CO2 removal or 1 ton of CO2 reduction from the atmosphere. And 1 ton is equal to 1,000 kilos of CO2. And these carbon units are generated in carbon projects. You can think of reforestation projects or cookstove projects. And carbon units are purchased by companies or individuals that want to compensate for their carbon footprint. So they can take responsibility for their irreducible carbon emissions. So 1 carbon unit, very simple, is just 1 ton of CO2 removal or reduction from the atmosphere.
Perfect. I think this is a very good start. So 1 carbon unit is always going to be 1 ton, which is 1,000 kilograms of carbon that we emit to the atmosphere, correct?
Exactly.
Perfect. So there are no different, okay, this carbon unit is worth more than this one. Like it's always 1 ton.
Yes, it's always representing 1 ton of CO2 removal or reduction.
So following up, Vinke, to our next question, how much carbon usually a person emits a day? Because we have, a ton of carbon, is that a lot? Is 1 carbon unit enough to compensate for example, my credits or something like that?
Yeah, no, it's not enough to compensate for your whole life. Carbon can be indeed quite vague, like what is 1 ton of CO2? So on average in Europe, it's around 8 tons of CO2 per person per year. So an average European person emits 8 tons of CO2 per year. But this is of course highly depending also on that person's activities. And it's still an average and it's still vague, like what is 8 tons? So maybe let's give an example of flights. So from Amsterdam to New York, we go back and forth. A return flight emits around 2 tons of CO2. So you can imagine that if someone is flying up and down New York all the time, their average carbon footprint is much higher than those 8 tons only. Another example, for instance, food. So if you have a vegetarian diet, you only emit half the emissions of someone with a meat diet or someone that eats meat regularly. And to compare it, if you eat around 70 meat meals, that is equal to 1 ton of CO2. And remember, 1 ton of CO2 is equal to 1 carbon unit.
Wow, that is
Does
indeed
it
a
make it
lot.
more tangible?
Yeah, that makes it much more realistic and applicable to our day to day. But if you do want to go over, because what we're talking about right now is how much carbon we're emitting. So this is essentially our carbon footprint, right? And we actually did have a webinar about carbon footprints last month that can still be watched on our website. So if you want to learn more about that, you can just go to DGB, go to our events, and you'll see the past webinars there. James just asked, what are average business emissions? I think this really depends on the type of business that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. But so I know, for instance, from experiences that in the Netherlands or in Europe, if you have a service company, then it's around 3 tons of CO2 per employee. So you can, use that as a benchmark, but it's highly depending if you have green electricity or gray electricity, if you are a production company, of course, or just a law company. But so we have indeed a CO2 expert tool. So it's an online tool to calculate your carbon footprint, and we guide you through the whole process and also give you a validated carbon footprint. So, but that's another topic.
Right. Yeah, this is actually really interesting to mention. We do have this tool that people can use to help them calculate your emissions. I just put the link in the chat if you want to check this out later. But let's get back to our topic, which is carbon units. If you have any questions, please ask them at the end of at our Q&A session today. So, going back to carbon units, I've heard many names for this before. We talked about carbon units. There's a lot of people that say carbon credits. What is the difference between a carbon unit, a carbon credit? Are there differences between carbon units?
Yes, carbon units are also referred to as carbon credits, indeed. Yes. And a carbon credit also represents 1 ton of CO2 removal or 1 ton CO2 reduction. Yeah.
Perfect. And how is a carbon unit created? Like, for example, if I plant a tree on my backyard, do I get a carbon unit or a carbon credit?
No, you don't get a carbon credit if you plant a tree in your backyard, but I do always encourage you to plant a tree in your backyard. The more trees, the better. But there's a real difference indeed in individuals or companies planting a tree near their office or in their backyard, or buying official carbon units. So we at DGB, we are project developer. So we also plant trees. We set up reforestation projects in Africa, but it's really more than just tree planting. We accurately measure and certify the amount of CO2 that we store into our project. So this process uses very strict standards and strict methodologies to ensure that the carbon savings we claim we store are also real and checked by a third party. To make it simpler, we have barren land in Africa. We plant a tree will grow, and every 3 to 5 years, the validation company will come to the project to measure the amount of CO2 that the tree has captured while growing. Because if a tree grows, it captures carbon from the atmosphere. So our projects are verified and monitored, ensuring that if you buy a carbon unit, your investment really contributes towards that measurable carbon reduction. And if you just plant a single tree or more trees, you're not entirely sure the amount of carbon that is stored. So you cannot use that tree for your sustainability targets or for the real reduction. So to sum up, yes, plant a tree because it's also giving a lot of social and local benefits, of course. But if you really want to use it for your sustainability targets and you want to have a measurable carbon reduction, then it's also recommendable to buy carbon units.
That makes sense. I think it just goes around of, when it comes to our carbon emissions, we are actually actively measuring them and trying to be as precise as possible. And if we really want to cause an impact and we really want to cause a positive impact, we need to precisely compensate for what we are emitting. And the only way to do that, a very, very efficient way to do that is through carbon units, because that is already measured precisely from our company and also the third-party companies that are validating those carbon units. So that makes perfect sense. And regarding those carbon credits, how long do they last? So if you, for example, DGB plants a tree in Africa, how many credits are we going to get out of the tree? How long will those credits last? How does that work?
Yeah, so a carbon credit is 1 ton of CO2 removal or reduction. So it's not about that you're not buying a tree. And the one carbon unit represents 1 ton of CO2 removal one time. So it's just a one-time purchase that can be used one time. So let's take an example for a company that emits carbon into the atmosphere every year through its business activities. And in general, a company will measure the carbon footprint from the past year. So now we are in March 2024, so we will measure the carbon footprint for 2023. These are past emissions, and carbon units are normally bought to compensate for those past emissions. So as one carbon unit represents 1 ton of CO2 removal reduction one time, they need to purchase carbon credits to compensate for 2023 emissions today. But if they want to compensate for 2024 emissions, they need to purchase carbon units again next year because it was just one-time purchase or one-time use. So it just can be used one time, and it's not that the carbon unit can last for 6 or 7 years indeed, because if it's used, it is retired, to call it in a more technical way. So if a carbon unit is retired, it is used by a company to compensate for their carbon emissions and cannot be traded or used elsewhere. Is that clear?
That makes perfect sense. In fact, now that you're explaining to me that way, I kind of think of it as since we're planting a tree and getting carbon units out of it, it's pretty much like getting a fruit out of a tree. Like you can only use it after you harvest it, and after you harvest it, you cannot use it anymore. So
yeah.
Just so for me to be clear, so every year we're gonna have a project that's gonna capture, let's say, 50 units of carbon in a year. So after those units are captured, only then we'll be able to use them to compensate for our emissions or trade them or do whatever we want to do with them, correct?
Yes, it's a bit more complicated. So indeed, if the carbon is certified by the validation company and we have issued carbon credits, then indeed we can sell those credits to our partners, but we can also sell forward future carbon credits. But it's a bit more too complicated maybe for this for beginners webinar.
Well, yeah, I think then it kind of becomes more of a financial thing. Like you can trade on future dollars. You can also buy dollars today. I imagine it must be something like that, right? We have a question from Den, which is kind of related of what we're talking about. So who actually issues a carbon unit or a carbon credit? Are these third-party validation companies? Is it us? How does that work?
Yeah, good question. So there are some certification companies out there. We work with the Verified Carbon Standard of Verra and also with Gold Standard. And those are the two standards that are worldwide mostly recognized. And they will indeed check all your documents. They will visit the project. They will measure the baseline. So what was the project without the tree planting? What is the project after 3 years? They will actually measure the carbon that we claim we store. They will measure it, certify it, and they will issue the carbon credits. And there's also a whole registry where they also have how much carbon units has DGB in their portfolio from which projects. And in that registry, we manage all the carbon units and the retirement to the companies.
Awesome. That makes perfect sense. And how long will a carbon unit last? So, for example, let's say we got some carbon units in 2015 from a project of ours. Until when we can use those credits?
Good question as well. So the last question was also like, how long does it last in terms of it's just a one-time purchase, so you can use. So 1 ton of CO2 removal or reduction one time. And if we retire the carbon unit, it cannot be used or traded anymore. So it's really used. So you really have compensated for that footprint.
That makes...
But indeed, if we generate carbon credits today, we can also sell them in 2 years to company to compensate for it.
Perfect. That makes perfect sense. We have a question from the audience. We have Wibrant asking a question that we actually already talked about in a little bit before, which is what is the difference between a carbon credit and a carbon unit? They're just two
Yes.
different names. But now that he mentioned that, or she mentioned that, I just thought of a question, which is, are there differences between carbon units? Because I see that there are many different options in the market for me to purchase. So what is the difference between carbon units themselves?
Yeah, there are a lot of differences actually. We can dive very deep into this, but maybe let's take one step back. So there are reduction carbon units and removal carbon units. So these are the main differences. And reduction carbon credits is already in the name. They actively reduce carbon going into the atmosphere. And as an example, I will give you a cook stove project. So in Africa, we give local communities more sustainable cook stoves. And these stoves, that the local community can cook in a more sustainable manner, which is less polluting, so less CO2 is going into the atmosphere compared to the original stove. And this reduction in CO2 emissions going into the atmosphere is certified, and it's called a reduction carbon unit. So because you really reduce carbon going into the atmosphere. While on the other hand, we have the removal carbon units, and it's also in the name, it removes carbon or carbon from the atmosphere. So this is a tree planting project. So we plant a tree grows, and while it's growing, it captures carbon into the soil, in the branches, and this removal and what we sequester in the trees is measured and certified, and it's called a removal carbon credit. So this is the main difference between reduction and removal carbon credits. I also got quite often the question, okay, but what is a high quality carbon unit? Because there are low quality, high quality. Well, that is actually depending on a lot of different characteristics. So the characteristics of a carbon unit. For example, we will look at carbon. So how long is the carbon stored in the project? What is the permanence of the carbon? But also we can make it very technical. We can dive into leakage. Sounds complicated, but for instance, if we have a project area where we want to plant trees, how do we get to that project area? Do we need to construct a road? Do we need to clear trees or cut trees to come there? And do we then counterbalance for this leakage of carbon? So carbon is something that you need to dive into if you want to compare different carbon units with each other, but also the beyond carbon impact. So the social impact, for example, is the local community happy with the project? Is there a benefit sharing system in place? Do the local people also benefit if we sell or I sell the carbon units for a much higher price? Do they also benefit from that higher price? Because if not, they might feel neglected and they might feel not happy about it. So it's really important to have a benefit sharing system in place as well, and to really include the local community in your decision making. So this also makes a carbon unit a high quality carbon unit. So it's about carbon, it's about social impact, and also about biodiversity, for example. So the environmental impact, the overarching impact on the surrounding areas. Because I think you're in Brazil, so you see a lot of these eucalyptus trees. And what you see is you see a beautiful forest that grow really fast, and they capture a lot of carbon actually. But they extract all the water and the minerals from the soil, which means that no other plants or animals can live over there. So actually it's even worse for biodiversity and for the environmental ecosystem, because you plant these eucalyptus trees, just grows with it. On the other hand, we plant biodiverse native tree species, where we have a different mix of different trees that belong over there. And it might take longer, for the forest to grow, but in the end, it will make a much greater impact on the overall ecosystem. So high quality carbon units compared to low quality carbon units is because of the carbon, the social impact, environmental impact, also the certifications. So we are certified by a third party. Not every carbon unit is certified. Additionality, what is the additionality of a project? Does it really bring something extra? monitoring of the project. Well, there's a lot, but these are some topics that you can dive into.
I think it's so interesting that you mentioned the eucalyptus trees here in Brazil because it's crazy. It's so true. I
Yeah.
remember when I was very young, it was kind of a very popular thing to plant a lot of eucalyptus trees because people would see that as sort of an investment.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so eucalyptus forests were like sprawling all over Brazil, and I remember walking through them when I was a child, and you didn't even have like mosquitoes coming at you, which mosquitoes here in Brazil are crazy, and
Yeah.
in those forests you don't even have those. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that because I could relate that to my personal life. And what you mentioned about actually helping actively the communities in where these projects are happening, I think that is very interesting. And if you look, of course, if you look at the social aspect, of course we want to help everyone that is involved, but also in the economic aspect that makes a lot more sense as well, because if the community is being actively helped from the project and getting benefits out of the project, then they also have a reason to help us with that project and to maintain those trees planted and not cut them to make firewood or to do whatever. So it is
Yeah.
even like more reasons for those trees to be standing up and more of a guarantee that these trees will be standing 10, 15 years from now. So
Yeah.
I think that is really, really interesting. Um, so
Yeah,
just
indeed. Like the local community really safeguards the project then from failing, sort of like for illegal logging or indeed putting the project on fire. So if the local community is happy, then it's really important for us for the safety of the project.
perfect. That's great. Regarding this topic, we have one more question from Audrey. So, coming back to reduction and carbon units. So, reduction carbon units are sponsoring activity to be more sustainable, quote unquote. Would that be
Yeah.
a correct assumption?
Yeah, indeed. So reduction carbon units can also be referred to as a sustainable solution to something else. Yeah.
Perfect.
But it needs to be additional. So there are a lot of requirements, of course, that needs to get along with the sustainable solution.
Right. So me taking a bike to work every day instead of driving my car wouldn't be considered a carbon reduction activity
No,
for a carbon
exactly.
unit project.
No, so because it needs to be additional. So without carbon credits or carbon units, the project should otherwise not come off the ground. So the local community in Kenya, for example, would never purchase these sustainable cook stoves themselves. So only with the investment of carbon credits, we can actually generate this carbon or this cook stove, and we can provide them to the local community. So without carbon units, they would not come off the ground otherwise.
Perfect. That makes perfect sense. I see that we have a lot of questions coming up on the chat, and I just want to ask everyone to bear with me. We're going to go over all of them, but we do have some questions before that we need to get to, but all of your questions will be answered until the end of the webinar. Don't worry about it. So, Vinke, we were talking about different types of carbon units and different types of carbon credits, how they are generated, how are they created. So when I think of my personal carbon footprint, I kind of separate what I am emitting in kind of two categories. So my constant or recurring emissions and my one-time emissions. So for example, my constant emissions would be what you mentioned, like what I eat every day, how much energy I'm using in my house every day. And these one-time emissions would be like, I don't know, I take every 5 years I was able to take one vacation and I go out of the country and I fly a plane, or I decide to do like a big renovation and I purchase a lot of concrete and there's a lot of carbon coming with that and the transportation with that. Is there a different way to cope with those emissions? Is there a different strategy? Or do I have to use different types of credits for those?
Interesting question. Because as a person, indeed, you have these recurring and one-time emissions. But as a company, of course, you have the same thing, because you have recurring emissions like your electricity bills from your office, but recurring or one-time emissions from, let's say, an anniversary trip of your company's 200 years existence. So, but you always measure your carbon footprint on a yearly basis, or that's the most common. So you always look back at 2023, for example. And this will include both recurring emission and one-time emissions. And you purchase carbon units to compensate for these past emissions. So there's no difference between carbon units used for recurring emissions or carbon units used for compensating these one-time emissions. So it's indeed the same. It's just one carbon unit is 1 ton of CO2 removal or reduction.
Well, that makes perfect sense. When you measure as a whole and you measure them at the same, would be much easier. So yeah. So let's say I do compensate my carbon footprint this year. What if something happens with the trees of the project that I purchased these credits from? Do I lose my carbon credits? Do I have to purchase them again? What do I have to do?
Yeah, so this is a very good question, which I get quite often. So what if the project that I support, so the trees indeed, the project fails? Of course, all of our projects or reforestation projects are designed in such a way that they are most resilient to prevent from failing. So, for example, we already mentioned we work very closely together with the local community to safeguard the project from illegal logging, for example. But we also implement fire breaks to prevent from fires. We plant biodiverse trees for a resilient forest against diseases. So we do a lot of things to help prevent the project from failing. But indeed, what if after all these risk mitigation activities, the project still fails? So we are certified by the third party. I told you before, the verified carbon standard. So let's take this one as an example. The verified carbon standard has a buffer pool, a so-called buffer pool. And this means that every project that is certified with this standard needs to allocate a certain percentage of their total carbon units towards this buffer pool. And the amount of credits that you need to allocate to this buffer pool is depending on your risk level. So let's say 10%. So a project developer like us is not able to sell 10% of the carbon units they generate because this carbon unit, that 10%, is allocated to the buffer pool of the certification. So if a project anywhere on the world with this certification fails, you as a company that has purchased carbon credits from this project is still sure that your carbon is removed from the atmosphere because at that moment they will use the buffer pool for this failed project. So does that make sense? It's quite complicated, the buffer pool.
Yeah, it's kind of carbon insurance, I would say. Like you save it a little bit in case something happens.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's kind of insurance for your carbon capture. It's actually the insurance that the certification gives to their buyers that are buying these types of credits under this certification. Yeah.
That's great to hear because at the end of the day, what we want to do, of course, we all have business goals in mind and we also have the necessity to compensate for our businesses' carbon footprints. But at the end of the day, we want less carbon in the atmosphere overall. So I believe that these measures actively help us to actually reach the objective no matter what happens at the in the middle of the way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, carbon units are a great way to financing these much needed reforestation or natural ecosystem restoration projects. Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's very, very clear and very perfect. So my last question is actually one of the, it kind of ties with one of the questions that we have received from Din as well. I kind of already asked before, what are the different types of carbon credits that I can purchase? But I see that there are also very, very different pricing when it comes to carbon credits. So how much usually can we pay per carbon credit? Is there any type of pricing that we can use as a standard to believe, okay, this is a high quality carbon credit, this is not a high quality carbon credit? Or is it like, I don't know, wine? You have really expensive wines that are not that good, but some cheap ones that are great.
Yeah, I don't think we can set a specific price on a certain type of carbon credit. But in general, the reforestation projects with biodiversity and local community benefits are priced a bit higher. I think it's now around 25, 35 euros per ton of CO2. But it can also go up to 50 euros per ton or 60 euros per ton. And then you also have the eucalyptus tree plantation projects. So these projects are less expensive. I think it's more around 10, 15 euros per ton of CO2. And this is because they can also harvest the trees. So we plant trees without any harvesting cycles, but there are also reforestation trees with harvesting cycles. And they have another revenue stream as well. So they don't only, they have more different revenue streams than just the carbon credits.
Perfect. That makes sense. I'm checking the other questions that we have from the audience, because actually we do have a lot of questions to go through, and I want to go through all of them before we finish today. We actually have a very good question from cash, which is related to what we're talking about. So how is the price of carbon credits determined? Who sets this price, and what factors influence the market value? I think you kind of went over some of them, but do we have more specific data on that?
Yeah, so it's really depending on the quality, but also on the cost of the project, of course. So if the project, in which country it is, so it's really country specific as well. Do you purchase forward carbon credits? Do you take a risk in the project? Then it's more like an investment. So then there's a lower price related to it, of course. Yeah, so it's really depending on a lot of factors. Also the certification, because the certification is also not for free, of course. If it's a really big project size, then all these costs, then you have economies of scale. So there are a lot of different factors that determine the price of a carbon unit, yeah. But mostly it's cost-based.
Perfect. And now the second part of the question from Cash, which is a very, very good question, which is, what are some of the criticisms of the carbon credit system? So specifically was mentioned like concerns about greenwashing or claims that it doesn't address a larger issue of overconsumption. So what are some of the most common criticisms that you hear on a day-to-day basis, and what do you say to that?
Yeah, so I think there are two differences. So on the company side, so the user side and the developer side. So let's start with the user side, indeed, with the companies. If a company, a very polluting company, comes to me and they have a footprint of 10,000 tons of CO2, they don't do any reduction measurement, they just want to compensate and want to claim that they are carbon neutral. Then I'm like, okay, hold back, let's take one step back. Who are you? What are we going to do? Because indeed, carbon credits are a great way of financing much needed reforestation and nature projects. But it's also important that a company focuses on internal reductions. With only carbon compensation, we will not save the world, but also not only with internal reductions. So you should have a strategy where you can implement both strategies to go to zero. So net zero can only be reached by a combination of internal reductions, helping your partners in your whole value chain to reduce as well, but also start with compensating, because compensation, you can take responsibility for your carbon footprint, but you also help nature again, restore nature, biodiversity, you help local communities in developing countries. And indeed, it can be used to improve your brand reputation, of course. But then you need to buy these high quality, high integrity carbon units that make a real measurable carbon reduction. And then we go to the other side, so the project developer side. It's really important that you know your project developer. There are a lot of different players in this carbon market. And in every market there are also some cowboys. So I call them carbon cowboys. What they do, they just buy very cheap carbon credits and they sell it for the highest price. Where's the money going to? So I think this is the main, criticism that the carbon market gets. We don't know exactly how the money flows. So therefore, I'm very happy to be with the project development. So the project development, so I see exactly where the money is going to, and that the money is also going to the local community and to tree planting. So both on the developer side and the buyer side, there are some criticisms. It's a developing market, so it's also not perfect yet. But it's just much needed. And it's a great way of bringing extra money towards this kind of projects.
Of course, as if with any industries, there are the ups and downs, and there are, of course, the flaws that we are trying to mitigate and work with. So that makes perfect sense. And even if a company is only trying to compensate, is not trying to reduce over time, even financially and economically speaking, they will realize that. I mean, just compensating is just an extra cost. If you can avoid that cost, which is by scaling back your emissions, then it's just less money that you have to spend year after year. So it's
Exactly. Yeah,
another
it's also
thing.
a financial incentive, carbon offsetting. Yeah.
Exactly.
Actually, here in Singapore, they also have the carbon tax, which means that it's only for the very big companies, but they get tax benefits if they compensate for just a very small amount. But still, they promote it but only with a high integrity carbon credit. So they have very strict requirements, but it's a good way to stimulate the market.
Perfect. We also have a question from James, which is if DGB sells carbon credits, and also Cash asked, which is a question that fits with that one. As an individual, where can I buy carbon credits? Essentially, as an individual, not a company, where can I buy carbon credits? And what should businesses look for when buying carbon credits? For example, how to avoid a low quality carbon credit.
Yeah, so first question, as an individual, you can buy carbon credits with us. So you can just give me or Pedro a call, but also on our website. So we also have tree planting projects where you can buy a tree and it's also capturing carbon, but also for the carbon credits. And the other question was about...
If you are purchasing those credits, how can you make sure that you're getting high quality carbon credits?
Yeah, so I know for a company it can be quite hard because every reforestation project says that they are high quality and they have biodiversity. And then if you have a good look into the whole documentation, you see that they just plant two different types of eucalyptus trees and then claim to be biodiverse. So it can be very hard to distinguish these high quality from low quality credits. I think therefore we are here. So therefore there are a lot of carbon experts in the market that can help you, guide you through these differences. I think the highest quality credits you will get from the project developer, because then most funds are really dedicated towards making an impact instead of buying from middlemen or big traders or big brokers. But they can also have high quality credits and low quality credits. So, but yes, these characteristics, so social impact, biodiversity, leakage, there are also, so you have B0 and Silvera, and these are two rating agencies. So they have information online about different carbon projects. So you can also help or use that tool to determine the quality.
That makes sense. And as if with anything, we always are going to research the company in which we're buying from to understand if this company, if we like what they're talking, if we trust them and all that. So this is it's also very important just to follow the company, see what's up with what they're doing. When it comes to future trends in the carbon credit market, is it expected to grow, and how might regulations change in the future?
Good question. Yeah, so it's really expected to grow. So you might be aware of all the commitments that companies take, so net zero commitments. So, for example, a company or a big corporate has net zero commitments for 2030, which means that they are reducing their carbon footprint internally, but they also need to purchase carbon units to compensate for the irreducible carbon footprint. And as 2030 is coming closer and closer, these high quality carbon credits will be very scarce. So this will also, demand will go up, prices will go up as well for these high integrity carbon units.
Perfect. And we do have a lot of questions. I want to get to every one of those before the end. But if we don't get through all of the questions, please don't be afraid to reach out to me or Vinke. You have our email addresses, you have our contact information. If you want to talk more about, your carbon strategy, how we can help you to reach your environmental goals, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to have this conversation with you. Because of course, as with anything in life, a carbon strategy is going to be specific for you. Your carbon strategy is not going to be the same as my carbon strategy. So it's good to have these individual conversations as well. We have a question that is from the very beginning, which is, we're talking about trees, but what about carbon credits for landfill avoidance? Can you talk to us a little bit about those?
For landfill avoidance?
Yes, is that a thing?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of different types of credits. So you have carbon credits from reforestation projects, from protecting forests, from cookstove projects, from water projects, energy projects. We also have biodiversity credits, we have plastic credits. So indeed, there are a lot of differences. I don't have a lot of experience in landfill avoidance credits. We don't have these credits yet, but might come.
And those credits, they are just like a different type of credit, correct? Like, so, for example, now it's a question that I have actually. For example, if I want to compensate my carbon footprint, does it really matter if I go to a landfill credit or a reforestation credit or a cookstove project credit, or it doesn't make a difference?
No, it doesn't make a difference. No, if it's a carbon credit, so if it's capturing 1 ton or avoid or remove or reduce 1 ton of CO2, then you can use it as a carbon credit to compensate for your carbon footprint. So that's a good one, actually. A carbon reduction credit is also called, sometimes we go very deep, a carbon avoidance credit, because it avoids carbon going into the atmosphere with that sustainable solution.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so if you avoid it from going to landfill, but you recycle or whatever, then indeed it's an avoidance.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Din also asked I understand that DGP is selling carbon credits and carbon units. Does DGP also buys carbon credits and carbon units from others?
Well, we are a project developer, so indeed our main focus is to develop projects and to sell our carbon units to the end users. But sometimes we are in need of a carbon project similar to ours, then we can have a chat, definitely.
Awesome, perfect.
But it's not our main focus.
Right, our main focus is to develop projects and to plant trees, essentially.
For nature.
Exactly. But by all means, reach out to Vinke and have a conversation about that. I am checking out if there is any questions that I left out. Vinke, meanwhile, do you have any final messages that you would like to get across to all of our amazing audience? I mean, we have more than 30 people with us today. That's just great.
That's great. Yeah, so first of all, of course, thank you so much for joining this webinar. I would really believe that carbon units are a great way of bringing more money to reforestation and nature projects. Because without these carbon units, we would have never been where we are right now. And that is that we have more than 7 projects developed, up and running in Africa. A lot of very, very happy people. A pipeline, we are going to remove more than 60 million verified carbon from the atmosphere. So that is enormous. So if you want to be part of it, feel free to get in touch with Pedro or with me. After the webinar to help nature flourish again.
Exactly. We do have 2 last questions before we go, which are questions that I left in the past, but they're coming back now. So Ari asked, what is the difference between voluntary and compliance carbon credits?
Good one. So actually, they are not mandatory carbon credits. These are called carbon allowances. And this is for the very big polluters. They need to buy these carbon allowances to emit. So this is a whole different market indeed. And the voluntary carbon market generates carbon credits. And these carbon credits can be used by companies to voluntarily compensate for their footprint. So it's totally voluntarily. And I remember that there was another question asking, is there regulations coming up? So there is already regulations indeed for the mandatory market, so the very big polluters. Regulation is there for calculating and setting targets for your carbon emissions, and there will come also compensation reducing measure or mandatory regulations, but it will be in the future. So not yet.
Perfect. And the last question from you, how do carbon units factor into corporate risk management strategies?
Yeah, so it's a way to counterbalance for your carbon emissions. So next to your internal reductions, you also need to mitigate your emissions in another way to reach net zero. So to avoid risk that you cannot reach net zero because you are not on time to purchase these high quality credits and they are not available anymore, you should already invest as soon as possible because there's just a scarce demand.
Perfect. And we just got another question from James. Can you give an example of a business buying carbon credits? For example, my business footprint is 100 tons of emissions per year. What do you do then?
Yeah, so 100 tons of carbon footprint. So if you want to compensate your full carbon footprint, it depends, of course, if it's scope 1, 2, or 3, but you can compensate all the scopes. Then, you will just be in touch with me. We will find the best fitting compensation projects. So we have 7 different projects you can choose from. We will discuss pricing. So it's between 15, 30 euros per ton of CO2. It's actually quite simple. We set up a contract, we sign a contract, and you will get a lot of marketing materials. You will get the certificates, of course. I will tell you everything about the project to bring the project as close as much to you.
Perfect. Yes, this conversation, if you have an individual conversation, that's going to be it is going to make much more sense to your business.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we will also always have a personal conversation.
Awesome. And well, James, I have to say from experience, whenever I talk to Vinke, I learn a lot every single time. So you definitely want to have a conversation with her because she is always sharing a lot of knowledge with us. And the last question from Jonathan is, what about minimum tillage, which keeps under the soil? Can you get carbon credits for that?
You can get carbon credits for your carbon capture in soil. There are a lot of different variants. So, Pedro is also going to organize webinars with the project developers. So the project side of DGB, I'm the commercial side. So feel free to join and ask all these questions to them.
Exactly. So from a spoiler from Vinke, we actually are having new webinars in the future with our actual project developers in the locations that we're doing the project. So that's going to be very, very exciting. But for now, I want to thank, first of all, everyone that joined us today. We still have more than 30 people here today. That's just amazing. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope that you found this informative and helpful. And most of all, I want to thank Vinke for sharing her time with us and giving us this absolute lesson in carbon units. Thank you so much, Vinke.
Great. Thank you as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining, every one of you, and see you next time.